You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Icons, where listeners are introduced to incredible people working within the law enforcement community who have made a profound impact in our world. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. On this episode of Icons, we're joined by guest host Madison Scott, the museum's manager of volunteer services, who is interviewing Anthony Amerson, the son of Lucius Amerson, the first black sheriff to be elected in the South since Reconstruction. In addition to hearing about Anthony's career, we'll hear insights into his experiences growing up with a father who was nationally and internationally recognized in the law enforcement community. Madison and Anthony discuss some of their shared experiences growing up in a law enforcement family and what effect this has had on them in adulthood. Tune into this episode to learn more about the familial relationships in law enforcement and how that changes their perception of law enforcement. And now for Icons, featuring Anthony Amerson, Remembering Your Roots.
We'll just start off by welcoming Anthony. It's so good to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode on our series. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. It's so good to see you again, Madison.
Good to have you. Could we just have you start by introducing yourself, telling us a little about yourself, and then tell us about your dad?
Absolutely. I'd be honored. My name is Anthony Amerson, and I am the son of the first black sheriff elected in the South since Reconstruction. A little bit about myself. I retired from the federal government after working overseas with the United States Agency for International Development. I served several tours in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Haiti. And I am an Army veteran and a former U.S. Army Ranger. A little bit about my father's historical marker in history is that the period that followed the Civil War in America was, in particular in the South, it was a very difficult time in American history. I'm quite sure a lot of your listeners know about the American history and how it was the difficulty of incorporating new rights and liberties to the different classes of people that lived in the South at that time. The sheriff's role primarily in rural America is to cover large boundaries and territories of land and to enforce the law, serve legal documents, arrest people, process complaints, things of that nature. So throughout the South, the legal structure was primarily set up with the sheriffs in the county, under the county government, of which the sheriff is a servant under the county government. They are always and have always been elected positions, and the individuals that served in those positions had a lot of authority in those counties. Interesting enough, during the period between roughly 1877 and 1950, the United States was a very different place. It was a very different place, and there were a lot of conflict taking place in the South. There was a lot of violence taking place in the South. And as a result, there were first and second migrations of African Americans from the South to go to the North to seek jobs, to seek educational opportunities, to seek housing opportunities. And as a result, there was a big collapse of the U.S. economy in the South during that time. And one of the reasons why is because the rule of law in the South was not equally applied to all of its citizens. There have been various documents and stories about this. Document is called the Green Book. The Green Book was a document used by a lot of African American travelers from the North who mostly families that migrated to the North and to the upper East Coast for jobs. They would use this as more of a guide to help them to avoid areas in the South where they could run into problems, either being arrested or harassed, or did not offer services to African Americans while they were traveling. And this particular element kind of gave us an insight into the difficulty that African Americans had moving around the South, where most of their families were originally from. Mm-hmm. So as a result, there was a lot of brutality, and a lot of this brutality left insecurity in a lot of people, and it basically took away their will and desire to remain in the South. However, there was a large portion of African Americans who did stay in the South. They had been raised in the South, they had bore their children, they started their families, and they just refused to leave. And here's where the entrance of a black sheriff kind of granted more security to these families that were committed to staying in the South. And in my father's particular case, after leaving the military, and I'll circle back to his military time because
Excellent.
I think you are a military buff and you like to know about a lot of those things. But after his military service, he stayed in the Army for 8.5 years. And he enlisted around the beginning of World War II. World War II was around the 1940s, and I think he came on board around the late 1940s, early 1950s, and he was deployed to Korea primarily. And in Korea, he served under the 1st Cavalry Division. And as we all know, in the Korean conflict, as it's described, it was basically a standoff where the United States just decided it's better to just help them establish this point of demarcation and to leave the country. But as a result of that experience, my father was inspired to continue his military career after his initial enlistment. And after he re-enlisted, he was deployed to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then to Germany, where he served with the Big Red One. The Big Red One is very, very famous U.S. Army unit that a lot of people have known about for a long time. It was while he was at the Big Red One in Germany that he decided to advance his military career, take more professional development training, and also pursue his GED. And after being assigned to Germany, he was assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of the 82nd Airborne Division. It was at Fort Bragg that my father continued to advance his professional development, as well as take training such as air transportability courses and other courses in marksmanship to advance his military career. And ultimately, he signed up for the GI Bill at that time. And after Fort Bragg, he was deployed to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where he served his last years of his service as a drill sergeant at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And after Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his degree, he decided to go to Tuskegee to utilize his GI Bill benefits to further advance his education. So rewind and fast forward. He comes to Tuskegee as a student, and this is in early 1960s. And the early 1960s was a very interesting period in American history because they had just had a major national incident happen. Similar to what we're seeing in the news today, which the case that happened in Memphis, there was another similar case that happened in Mississippi, and it involved Emmett Till. Emmett Till, the story is a young African-American male who was originally from Chicago, but traveled to Mississippi to spend time with his family, and obviously unaware of the cultural differences as far as living in Mississippi. He had an encounter with a white woman, and this encounter later led to him being killed. And that picture of him being, of his body, kind of went across all national publications across the world, and it kind of called attention to the social issues going on in the United States. And these issues continued into the early parts of the 1960s. And my father, being a student on the campus, a lot of the students were attuned to these social changes that were going on, and a lot of them were proactive in voter registration, expanding their civil rights and their civil responsibilities by encouraging others to vote, registering others to vote. So he got caught into that a little bit, but not so much as far as wanting to lead protests and things of that nature. It's more or less the sentiment that was going on the campus at that time. But for him, he saw an opportunity because he noticed that in county government, there were different elected positions that you could run for. And he felt that because of his experience in the military, of course, in the military, you have access to a lot of training, a lot of experience, a lot of social skills in dealing with different people and often difficult people. Mm-hmm. And also you have a lot of exposure dealing with firearms. So those things, I think, gave him the confidence to believe that he could be qualified to run for and to be elected as a first black sheriff. at that time, I don't think he was aware of the historical significance, meaning there was a period in time from roughly 1877 to 1965 where there were no elected black sheriffs in the South. And when we say South, we're talking about Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina. All of those areas is, that we now look at as that's what they call the South. And that was a very large amount of territory. So he was unaware of that kind of that significance. He was more focused on how can I make a change? How can I actually impact society positively? So with a small loan that he got from his mother, he organized a campaign and officially filed his candidacy to run for sheriff. And this happened on or about the 1966 time period. I was about probably 7 months old at the time. Have very, very little memories of this, but nevertheless, he ran, was elected, and he stayed sheriff for 20 years. The sheriffs run on a 4-year cycle. So every 4 years, they have to run for re-election. And like I said, Dad was elected 5 times consecutively over and over. So my whole childhood growing up, all of my memories of my father is serving as sheriff. No other capacity but as sheriff.
Clearly he was doing something right. He kept getting reelected. He was a busy man. Interesting
enough, the sheriffs have a real important role in communities. And in most of the communities or counties, as they're referred to, they're very close-knit communities. People are spread out because of the fact that it's in rural area, but they tend to have more closer relationships with one another. And I think that because my father was from the South and because he was able to connect with people to reassure them that he was here to help them, to support them in his role as sheriff, that kind of led to his success in being elected over and over again. In fact, there were a lot of people that was pissed off that he got elected over and over. I can recall as I got into high school, I had become more knowledgeable about this whole election process and the announcements and all of the electoral processes involved. But at one point, there were about 7 people that ran against my father for sheriff at one time.
Oh, that's a lot. Wow.
Yeah, it was like there was just this concerted effort to just get Sheriff Amerson out of office. And when you think about it, the sheriff has to be the bully in the county. He has to be the person to go up and arrest people, which is not a good thing. He has to be the person to enforce the court's laws, court papers, and that's not often a very popular person. But nevertheless, my father didn't look at it like that. It looked at it as just a component of public service, more or less. So he didn't look at it as I got to be a bad guy, but a part of his duty, he had to be a bad guy to a lot of people.
Now, I know like you just kind of mentioned, his military career definitely set him up, I'd say, for success in this new role, and probably really aided in being a big strength of his, having this military background. But what do you think were some of his other strengths as a law enforcement officer?
Well, one thing I think helped him a great deal getting started was the fact that this is a rural county. And he's coming from exposure and experience of being in the Army, being overseas, having responsibility, being in charge of people, having to follow standard operating procedures, having to provide written counseling to soldiers. All of those social skills, I think, helped him a lot in his job as sheriff. I noticed that as I was archiving his personal records, I found documents where he had set up like a code of conduct for his deputies. And he had listed them out 1 through 15 or 16 so responsibilities and duties that the deputies had to perform. And I noticed one stood out more than other, and it was the fact that deputies could not have alcohol while they was on duty. And I thought that it's a no-brainer, but if you don't have it written anywhere, then it's, up to the individual to interpret. But this was how far behind that the sheriff's office were organizational-wise during that time, where he had to actually come in and put in policies and procedures to run an office effectively. And I think he pulled a lot of those strengths and attributes from his military time he spent in the military.
One thing we talk about when giving tours here at the museum, and we always mention your dad on the tours and talk about him and show the artifacts that we have on display and the video that we have about him, is how he really went in and kind of cleaned house. Was like there we need to institute these changes. He really came in with this mindset of change, which I think was necessary at the time. And it seems like he did such a good job of that. Can you maybe kind of talk more about the change that he made when he went into office?
Right. That's a great, very important part of my father's history, is that he actually came in and reformed the duties of sheriff at that time. Years ago, the sheriff's office was kind of this sleepy town job, sort of like Sheriff Taylor on the Mayberry show,
Andy Griffith, yeah.
Yeah, Andy Griffith show, where, the town drunk would check himself into jail voluntarily, and, Aunt B would stop by with biscuits and muffins. And so he reformed it totally, because he looked at it as an approach that this is an operating a job that was reportable to its citizens, accountable to its citizens. So he really took the approach to make sure that the equipment, the staffing, and the training that his deputies had would allow them to efficiently perform their duties and responsibilities in the office under the sheriff. One of the things he did immediately was he changed all the locks in the jail.
Oh, really?
For whatever reason, when he took office, all of the keys to all of the cells were missing.
Oh, geez.
And after discovering this, he had to get a locksmith and, of course, get all the locks changed. But I found that to be very strange that the sheriff did not have keys to all of the jail cells. But for whatever reason, this kind of gives you insight into how those offices were being run back then. It was more or less a reflective of the time. And then also the people were there. There were not a lot of people from outside the county that wanted to run for sheriff. So my father was kind of considered an outsider. And like I said, the experience he brought from his military career and his training allowed him to go in and kind of structure and set the sheriff's office to be more functional and responsive to the needs of its citizens.
Now, as he entered the office for the first time, was there any pushback from the community at all, as he was the first African-American sheriff to be elected?
Absolutely. There was a lot of pushback, and the pushback started surfacing during his initial campaign. During that time, the way Southern politics were conducted, you would go around and host town hall meetings in different parts of the county. And this would allow the local citizens to come out and meet and greet the new candidates. And while Macon County is about 550 square miles, which is about the size of Central Park in New York, it's a lot of territory. And all of that territory was not primarily inhabited by African Americans. For your listeners that don't know, Macon County in Alabama is primarily inhabited by 86% African Americans, maybe 80% back then in the 1960s, but it's been a predominantly African American county in Alabama for a long time. And during these town hall sessions, some were hosted in communities that were primarily occupied and lived in by white citizens. So we had opportunity to meet everyone, and there were a lot of resentment, specifically in the area of threats against him from the Klan and from other people who just thought that the time just was not right to have an African American in that position. Because like I said, the sheriff was the bully. And he also had to have insight into everything that was going on. Moonshining and bootlegging and cattle rustling, and all of those things were very common vices and crimes that were taking place in rural America at that time. So a lot of people, or some of those who were doing those things, were very concerned with what role would the sheriff take in preventing them from continuing doing what they were doing, and whether that would jeopardize their interests and the interests that they had in continuing doing those type of activities.
That's so interesting. I can't even imagine just at that time how the community was so used to things being run one way, and then he pretty much stepped in and was like, nope, gonna change.
We got to keep in mind that there was a social change going on in America then, almost similar to what we're seeing today. We didn't have social media back then, but there was the voice of its citizens. The social justice issues going on in the United States were getting attention from all over the world. And it had really charged up the youth in the United States at that time. Of course, you're probably knowledgeable about sit-ins and other efforts that college students were doing to promote social change, voters' rights, registration. that was kind of the same energy level that we see today, as far as people being really focused on social issues. And when you think about it, following the Great Depression, which ended somewhere around the 1920s, early 30s, and then we had 2 wars after that, the United States economy was in terrible shape. So typically when the economy is in terrible shape, social issues tend to surface more as being problematic in a sense of rebellion, rights, people being disgruntled. So all of those things kind of continued to follow through all the way into the 1960s. And in the 1960s, like I said, that trigger event as far as Emmett Till's death kind of compelled everyone to socially get involved in what was going on in the shaping of new rules and laws in this country. So my father was kind of right at the tip of the spear when this change was taking place. There were most people that were in support of my father being sheriff. However, there was a large portion of African Americans that were not. And primarily their mindset was, we don't want to push change too fast, because if we push it too fast, people are not going to support it, and they're not going to comply with the change. And that was a real disturbing fact for my father as the first African American sheriff, because in a predominantly black county, one would think that, you would garner the support of the majority of its inhabitants, but that was not the case. Tuskegee University, which is the predominantly historical black college in Macon County, was composed of a different society. The society was composed of educators, rural farmers, transplant people that were coming to that county primarily for their education. So it was such a mixed group of people that the change and the sentiment for change was discussed at a lot of different levels. You had these intellectuals, you had the rural farmers, everybody had their concerns and their issues, but those things had a lot of impact into my father, his candidacy, and also who supported him.
Do you think, I'm sure I just can't even imagine the stress that he had, especially at the beginning of his career and having this new job. But over time with his career, do you think having his career in law enforcement changed his outlook on society at all? If so, how do you think it might have changed how he viewed society?
It changed his view on society a lot, because there were some things that he could not change. And primarily, while he had the authority to arrest individuals that were breaking the law, he had no control or authority over the courts actually convicting people for different charges. So I think that was a bit disheartening. And during that period, while he served as sheriff around the end of the 1960s, there was a lot of social revolution going on. In particular, there was a riot on the campus of Tuskegee University back then. The students were protesting their conditions. They were protesting the university board of directors' unwillingness to accept some of the social changes that were happening, and they started tearing up the campus. And my father was a student at Tuskegee at the time, but now in this role as a sheriff, he's been called to come onto the campus to quell this riot that's going on. And for a long time, the students were unwilling to, what they did, they locked up the board of trustees in one of the university's administrative buildings until their demands were met. Yeah, This is really crazy. And I'll tell you a story about that afterward. But when my dad got called out, he was informed that the governor wanted to dispatch the National Guard to go down there. And that wasn't going to be a good situation on that campus. So he interceded and went onto the campus. And he was ahead of the tank. They had rolled out a tank. He was standing in front of the tank. And he got on his bullhorn. He told all of the students to disperse and go home. Otherwise, he was going to let the tank come in and take control of the campus. They all put down their signs and went home. And the university sent everyone home. And while the students were at home, they reviewed video footage to see who was actively participating in protests. And if you were found to be actively protesting, you were not asked to return back to the school, and your money was not refunded.
Oh, dang. And
as a result, under Tuskegee University, because I am a graduate of Tuskegee University, they have this small fine print disclaimer when you register. It says that your money is not refundable for riots and any act of God that happens. So I always wondered where that came from until I found out that story about the riot that took place on the campus. It was real interesting that took place during that time. But his impact on society, I think my father felt that the social change was happening and he wanted to just be a conduit. He wanted to be a conduit to help people understand that you can be a part of helping change things in people's lives. You can be a positive influence, and you can exercise your civic responsibility as long as you was following the law. There were a lot of different groups that were emerging during the 1960s. Some had pro-militant ideas. Some were of the opinion that, when we get our opportunity, we want to do things our way. He was not of that opinion. He was of the opinion that let's do this thing right. Let's follow the law. And that was kind of what followed him throughout his career, was his unwillingness to cater to different sides, but to continue to follow the law.
How do you think his career impacted raising a family? I know you have 2 siblings. You're the middle child. How do you think it impacted not just his relationship with your mom, but just having kids and just family life in general?
Very difficult. Mm-hmm. Very difficult. As a child growing up in the family of a person that was so out front in the public, not only locally but nationally, it put a lot of strain on, I imagine, the relationship my mother and father had. I know, going through some of the archives, that my father he was invited to over 100 speaking engagements after he got elected. Wow. All across the United States. And that required him to travel. That required him to be away from home. And I know that put a lot of challenges on my mother raising us at the time. But I think more importantly, the important point to take away is that people have no idea the amount of stress that law enforcement officers have to deal with in their daily lives. It could be any day when you could almost lose your life, or you could lose your life in a routine traffic stop, serving the public. And that weighed on my father a lot. Of course, he was, as a former soldier, most of them smoked cigarettes. My father smoked cigarettes all the way up until he died. He wouldn't stop. Even after the doctors told him, he just could not stop. He was an adamant smoker, and when he came home, I always noticed that his mood was real kind of like low. His energy level was low. It was mostly like have dinner, speak with the children for a little while, and then he retired to bed and woke up. But I do remember when he was in a good mood, he would open up. My father, in the home we lived in, my father had a room that was off limits to the children. Mm-hmm. And I know it's a lot of men out there that had the same kind of thing set up, but he didn't like his kids in his stuff, his personal stuff. And his personal stuff and his enjoyment was his hi-fi stereo system. Yes. Now, I'm going to really date myself right now by telling you that prior to today, when we see Bluetooth speakers everywhere and we see everybody wearing AirPods, the stereo equipment that they had in the 1970s was basically furniture. It was like furniture that had speakers and all of the electronic equipment built in to look like furniture. And my father had in his room his hi-fi system, turntables, and his speakers. When he came home and he opened the door to his what he called boom boom room, and that music was blaring, we knew that he was in a good mood.
I love that.
And that's the time that we could go in, and he would welcome us in. As long as we didn't touch his equipment, he was okay. But that was the time that he allowed us to actually come in and enjoy and relax around him. And he really loved music. I mean, I going through his albums and the music that he kept, he was really into jazz, Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Jimmy Smith, and Isaac Hayes. Mm-hmm. Isaac Hayes wrote the soundtrack to a movie that came out in the 1970s called Shaft. And Shaft is this real hardcore instrumental with piano and guitar, and it's really, really funky. And matter of fact, I think some of your listeners can go and look and see that Isaac Hayes performed this song at one of the Grammys that was done years and years ago. But nevertheless, this was a really cutting edge song that had a lot of instrumentals and strings and such. What he would play that song over and over again. And it was just a part of his personality. And the fondest memories I have growing up is being in that room with him during that time, enjoying him while he was enjoying himself. And that left a real impression on me, to the point that as I got older, I started investing in my little stereo equipment, getting my little receivers and speakers together for my own little collection that I didn't let no one touch. But it inspired me a lot to see how music could be therapeutic in helping you deal with stress. And I think that's what he was doing. He was using music to actually deal with the stress of the job that he had.
Right. No, that makes sense. And what was the room called?
The Boom Boom Room.
The Boom. Okay. So aside from such a good memory of being able to go in there with your dad and create those memories, do you have any other memorable experiences as a child with your dad?
Oh, of course. I called him Daddy. And that's how me and my brothers addressed him. But I can recall he had purchased this 1965 Ford Mustang. He was going to use this as an auxiliary car in his duties while he was patrolling around the county. And he had it custom made, brand new engine, suspension, tires. It was a convertible. This Ford Mustang had what we called a souped up engine. I guess hot rodders back then in the day would call it, where you hot rod a car, increase the performance. Well, he took me and my brothers out and he was kind of test driving it. And we're little kids, we're riding around. Dad's got the top down. We like riding through the county roads like, hey, yeah, cool. And then he just started counting down how fast he was going.
Oh, geez.
He started, yeah, look, I'm going 70. We little kids laughing. 80. We laughing and giggling. 90. We laughing and giggling. Now it's getting a little bit scary. We like, Daddy, slow down. But no, 100, 110, 112.
Oh, my.
It was like, this is like 7 and 8 year olds. He was scaring the hell out of us at that time. But he knew how to control vehicles and he drove vehicles. And I think in the job as a law enforcement officer, you got to drive cars fast. And he just didn't want us to be, I guess, not exposed to that part of his career and his job where you got to drive cars fast. You got to chase people. So I thought that was very funny because while it was funny at the time, man, it was scary as hell because he was driving really fast. I had never been in a car with anybody driving that fast before.
Yeah. I'm sure he was like, don't tell mom.
Of course.
Keep it between us boys.
Yeah. It was kind of one of those bonding moments, when I look back at it, say, it was really cool. And, I can recall as I got older, I never drove that fast. But when I would get up that high, I would always think about how my dad was scaring the hell out of us about driving fast. So that was a really, really cool memory I had of my father. And also that Ford Mustang he had.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a cult car at the time. There was a lot of people that loved that Ford Mustang.
They were they were good memories, but did he ever have anything stressful happen on the job that you can remember him talking about at home?
I think all law enforcement officers can recall close encounters they experienced, either themselves or with other fellow officers that they work with. And in particular, my father had a close encounter that almost took his life. In the latter part of the 1970s, my father had been in office now an official term, one term, which was 4 years, and he was moving into his second term. And there was not a lot of willingness for some of the other law enforcement agencies in the state to cooperate with the black sheriff, but they had to. State troopers often were assigned to cover various areas of the state, and the state troopers fall under the governor. But however, the sheriff has jurisdiction over the county. But if a interstate or highway went through a county, a state trooper could continue to exercise his duties and authority as long as it was on an interstate or a state highway. And in one particular case, while I was going through the archives of my dad's stuff, I found a police report of an accident that he had where he almost lost his life. And this was a really a takeout of a movie because it started out as a car chase in another county where there were some juvenile delinquents in Montgomery, Alabama, which was about 45 miles away from Macon County. But nevertheless, there were some juvenile delinquents who had stolen a car, and they were just bailing down the highway, trying to escape. And at the same time, there was an Alabama state trooper that was actively pursuing them. Now, how did we know all of this? Because in the police report, there was a lot of radio traffic going on. And, while one of the things he did in his, while he was a sheriff, he upgraded the communication system within the sheriff department so they could connect with some of the other law enforcement agencies and they could communicate amongst each other because, like I said, the county was about 550 square miles. So while he was on duty, he heard the constant radio traffic going back and forth with the state trooper talking about he was in pursuit of these juvenile delinquents. So this is in the middle of the night when this is going on. And slowly he hears that the direction that the juvenile delinquents are traveling on, the road would eventually go through Macon County. And there was chatter over the radio about the state trooper wanting to coordinate with the Macon County Sheriff Department since he was going to go through their jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And the state trooper was like, well, we don't need to do that. And my father, hearing this on the radio, he immediately got annoyed. Mm-hmm. And at the time, he was on duty with this gentleman named Junior Taylor. When my father first got elected in office, he didn't have a lot of the resources to keep a fine-tuned fleet of cars running very fast because it costs a lot of money. However, there were a lot of people from the community that approached him and said, Sheriff, I want to help you. How can I help you? And this guy, Junior Taylor, he was a top mechanic in Macon County at the time. In fact, he was known for hot rodding cars. Mm-hmm. So my father looked at that as a benefit because he had somebody to help him keep his fleet running. And he also served as a special deputy. So in this particular night, my father and Junior Taylor were in a car together. And when this car comes barreling through the county, it passes by them. And the car passed by, and then the state trooper in pursuit, and then my father in his vehicle joined into a pursuit that took place in the middle of the night, chasing after these juvenile delinquents. They're going down these country 2-lane roads. If you can imagine in your mind, they didn't have streetlights back then. A lot of this is just rural areas, hairpin turns, hills up and down. You don't have a long view of vision. So it's very, very dangerous. And like I said, these guys were going high speed. What eventually happened, there was a truck that was hauling wood that was in front of the juvenile delinquents, and they were unable to go around it. They're on a 2-lane highway. And while they were trying to go around the vehicle, my father in his car had somehow got into the second position behind the juvenile delinquents. I think that the state trooper, for whatever reason, fell back in his position as they were pursuing them. And while my father was behind them, he was on the passenger side. Junior Taylor was driving. Mm. My father stuck his .357 out the window and tried to shoot the tires out because these guys didn't want to pull over.
Right.
Yeah. Do you know how difficult it is to shoot the tires out of a moving car while a car is moving?
Extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult.
Right.
During that time when he was trying to shoot the tires out, Junior Taylor lost control of the car, and the car ran off the road and caught on fire.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Caught on fire. And at that point, it turned from a pursuit into a rescue mission because when the car caught on fire, my dad was still in the car. And so was Junior Taylor. So emergency folks came out there, got him out of the vehicle. He suffered 3rd-degree burns over the majority of his body.
Wow.
And that gun, that .357 Magnum, was totally destroyed. But lucky, it is housed here in the National Law Enforcement Memorial Museum for people to see when they come to visit. What's significant about that accident, because it actually changed the community's view on my father. During that time, he was up for re-election, and after he got injured, he was evacuated to a hospital in Columbus, Georgia. I found cards and letters that people wrote to him from all over the country, wishing him a speedy recovery. And that was really inspiring because nobody feels appreciated when you're out, chasing bad guys and being the bully. But when you're about to lose your life, people can connect with you because they understand the risk of being in law enforcement. Long story short, while my father was in the hospital, he was up for re-election in a couple of months. And it took him about 6 months to recover from that. As a child, I remember him having to walk with a cane and go to therapy. But he won re-election without having to campaign.
That says something right there.
It said a lot. It said a lot. And I look at those old letters and those old publications people wrote to him, wishing him well and encouraging him to get back in office. It's very motivational. And I think that kind of made him be even more committed to doing his job and helping the community out as a whole.
Do you think he ever shielded some of the dangers of the job from you and your siblings, or was he always very open kind of about the things he was going through?
Oh no, my father was very private on that. We were children. The only way I found out the details of what I just described to you, going through his archives. Mm-hmm. My father was a pack rat. A pack rat in a sense of every news article, every letter, every photograph that he had during this period in his life, when his life actually just changed, he kept it. Some of those things I donated to the museum, and some I have in my possession. But as I go through those documents, I'm looking at actual people signing letters, stationaries that he had, letters that he wrote to people thanking them for coming out to support him, responses to invitations to come to speak. It was just a lot of written correspondence. I was like, the office of sheriff tradition didn't have a need for having like a secretary to actually prepare correspondence and respond to correspondence, confirm appointments and invitations. But he also brought in that component of the sheriff's office as well, having a dedicated secretary that could help him better manage those things. So that was a great thing. And I was really glad to see kind of like he really was concerned about keeping his rapport with the people that had elected him.
Right. No, I think that's really special. The relationship, it sounds like he built with the community was so important and like I think vital for the community at that time. And it sounds like he just did a fantastic job of it, going in, making these changes and building a trust within the community.
Yeah. And as I said before, he had received over 100 invitations to come to speak at different events at different churches and schools around the country. And often this was used to kind of ignite voter registration in those areas. And as a result, he was able to get a lot of other African Americans elected sheriffs in the areas where they lived at as well. So it was a lot of outreach. It was a lot of people wanting to hear his firsthand experiences about what motivated him and why he was motivated.
Were most of those invitations to come speak in the South? Did you find her? I mean, I know you said all over the country, but I don't know if a majority happened to be there.
That's a great question. The first round of speaking engagements happened in Cleveland, Ohio. My father was invited to go. Case Western Reserve, famous college, had a law enforcement refresher course. Immediately after my father got elected, he was sent there to go and get a police refresher course training. While there, he got invited to 2 locations, one at a church and another at another location, to actually do a speaking engagement.
I know one of the places where your dad's history is so well portrayed and archived is in the book Great Courage. Could you just share a little excerpt from that?
Sure. I'll just read an excerpt from the book. Before the last vote was counted, I had already received over 50 requests to be the keynote speaker at various functions. At one point, it became almost a job in itself to manage correspondence and coordinate my travel arrangements. The first event at which I spoke was in Cleveland, Ohio, where I attended a 2-week police refresher training seminar at Case Western Reserve University. At the end of my training, I was invited to speak in another part of Cleveland at the Olive Tree Coffee House at 11205 Euclid Avenue on the subject of Black Belt politics. The next day, which happened to be Sunday, I accepted an invitation to speak before members of the Antioch Baptist Church NAACP membership drive. Antioch Baptist Church was located at East 89th Street and Cedar Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio.
He was a busy man.
Very busy.
I love the tidbit. It was almost like a job in itself. Like it really was. He, aside from being sheriff, newly elected, was now almost like he was famous. I mean, it was so many people wanted to hear him speak and hear his experiences and how he got there.
Yeah. There was a cohort also of other newly elected Black officials that got invited to the White House, actually.
Oh, did he go
yes,
to that?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. He actually went to the White House and they spoke. This was President Johnson, who was in office at that time. And this group was invited up to speak to the president and kind of let him know the progress that the Democrats were making as far as getting officials elected in the South. And the thing I remember significant about that visit was he got these pair of presidential cufflinks given to him.
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
He kept them in his little inventory of his cufflinks that he had. And I said, wow, that's really cool at the time to get cufflinks from the president of the United States.
Yeah, that's really special.
Yeah,
that's
really, really special.
really awesome.
So my father had passed away and I was in the military and I was traveling around. I had all of these archives and records that were just following me everywhere I went and putting storage fees on it. And I just got to a point where I said, let me just go through this stuff and see what's there. And man, it was like a pot of gold.
Yeah.
And it had all these documents that I said my father had kept in. And it made it very easy for me to kind of organize everything chronological to understand a lot about what was taking place, because I said I was a very small child when these things were taking place and didn't have any idea about the severity or the importance of his election as the first Black sheriff.
At that time for you, it was just dad going to work.
Just dad, had no idea about that. No idea. This covers his actual life while in office from the beginning to end. The biggest problem I faced near the end of my first term in office was similar to those of other sheriffs in other rural Alabama counties: a lack of manpower and funding. The 3 deputies on my staff at the time earned between $3,000 and $3,500 a year. However, with over 500 square miles to cover in Macon County, 3 deputies was just not enough to cover them the way they should have been. This is an issue that we're seeing today also in law enforcement, is the inability to actually recruit and retain quality officers. I think I was doing some research yesterday, and of course the circumstances as far as what's going in the news today in the city of Memphis, I found out that the average salary of a police officer at the Memphis Police Department is about $61,000 a year. And how difficult it must be to recruit people to actually put their life on the line for a job that's only paying $61,000 a year. Yes, the cost of living in Memphis is significantly lower than in Washington, D.C., but how do you attract and retain people to serve in that kind of public servant capacity is the issue that was taking place back then, and as we see, is taking place now.
I was just talking this morning we had a group of officers come in this morning to the museum, and I was speaking to one of them, and that came up, how difficult it is for their agency right now for recruitment, and just across the nation, recruitment for officers is low, and it's really hard for them to get people to sign up to try to come on board.
It's very difficult. A lot of my friends and colleagues have been having a lot of conversations about the circumstances that happen in Memphis and trying to explain why. And on the surface, we only see the video. But behind the surface, there are so many components going on in how law enforcement officers are operated today. They really have a bigger challenge than they're capable of doing. And for that reason, there are some systemic issues that tend to arise when cases like this happen. People start questioning back and forth. Who are the officers? What is their background? What is the quality? How many candidates did you have? How many candidates were interested? What are the salaries? How many people stay beyond 3 years? How many people stay beyond 5 years? And right now, the police is having a lot of people that it's like, the hell with this. I can just go ahead and take my retirement. Why am I going to put myself in a situation where I could lose my pension? I could die. Helping the public?
don't want to be a part of that.
I don't want to be a part, and I can't blame them.
Yeah.
It's a lot of responsibility. These letters, I intentionally put a lot of those letters that my father received in the book so people can actually see an idea of, we didn't have social media back then. Everybody wrote letters. And it was so interesting. A lot of the letters that he received, people wrote them out in their own handwriting. And some used typewriters. But it was just such a difference than it is today, where everybody uses email and DMs and other forms of communication. Back then, it just went all the way back to, writing a letter. And believe it or not, their grammar and their English was so much better than it is today.
I love that.
Dear sir, we are two white Oregonans, I assume these are citizens from the state of Oregon, who support you in your present trouble. We are not civil rights fanatics. In fact, we are very conservative, but we support police efforts to maintain law and order no matter what race are involved. If you and your deputy were attacked, you have every right to use force to subdue the attackers. Best wishes in your fight for justice. Dear Sheriff, just a note to say lots of luck with your problem. As written in the March 1st Newsweek magazine, one suspect, while being booked for drunk driving, pulled a gun, disarmed you, and started shooting, creating one problem that he did. What were you supposed to do? Give him an ice cream cone and tell him try again? Fight back and lots of luck. Astonia, Oregon, White. It was so interesting how people kind of had to assign their racial identity to the letters, because in a letter you can't tell who was it coming from, but they chose to do that. And that was pretty much the standard at that time of how people kind of communicated.
It's so evident how, he reached across both aisles. He was so influential and so vital to what our nation needed at that time. And he left such a profound legacy. What are you doing now to keep your father's legacy alive today? I know that you're doing so much.
Great question. I've been working more than 20 years to find the right platform to keep my father's legacy going, and I think I finally found it. On March 1st, we announced the release of, we did a press release where we shared the establishment of the Sheriff Lucius D. Amerson Bridge Builder Foundation. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's going to be focused primarily on helping youth and youth mentorship in Macon County and Greene County. Why Macon County and Greene County? Macon County is where my father served as sheriff, and Greene County is the county where he was born at in Alabama. So ideally, this program is going to help with youth mentorship, primarily young children, males in the ages, teenagers. And we're going to start with 8 individuals in Macon County and 8 individuals in Greene County. Why 8? We need to start out small and build these young men. These young men that we're going to work with are going to be stellar examples in their community on how to demonstrate public service. They're going to be academically coached. They're going to be given access to resources and exposure to broaden their view on the importance of serving in their communities. And that's what we're focused on primarily. Otherwise, we've got some other things that are working on as far as branding and marketing. And of course, when you're starting a business, it's like there's a nonstop inferno of fires to put out. But I'm so happy to be at this stage of my life right now where I can commit the time and focus to expanding my father's legacy. I do want to note we're doing a book donation during the month of February. We're donating books. We're donating books to high schools in Macon County. We're donating books to high schools in Greene County. And we're also donating books in Tanzania and in Ghana. One thing that we found out is that youth all over the world need to be inspired. While to me, my father's story was, of course, I read all of these things and I see, oh, this was really significant. But to some kid that's over somewhere in Africa that doesn't know anything about the United States, this might inspire him to do the same thing in his own area. And that's kind of the benefit, the gift that keeps on giving by sharing a story, is that it actually inspires people. And it motivates me every day to figure out ways that I can make an impact, and I can use my father's story to inspire people to do better and be better servants in their own communities.
I love that. I think that's awesome. How are you guys donating books? Is there a way for our listeners, if they are interested, is there like a website or something they can go to?
Right. So as I said, we are starting up business and we're scaling. But at the moment, we have all of our social media platforms. Facebook, Sheriff Lucius D. Amerson. You can reach out and contact us. firstblacksheriff@gmail.com. You can contact us. We can coordinate donations. The books that are for Ghana and Tanzania have already been shipped out.
Okay, gotcha.
Already been shipped out. But if individuals want to buy books and donate to those, reach out. We can coordinate and make that happen.
Awesome.
Yes. While I was in the government, I worked overseas extensively, and I made a lot of friends and colleagues, and I have quite a few of them in Africa. And they were just so excited to have the opportunity to share my dad's story with young children in the schools over there. So we automatically just connected, worked out the logistics. We're going to do a presentation in a couple of weeks, soccer balls, books, cupcakes, ice cream. Kids in school, they want to have those things, but just to really make it a memorable experience, and also to leave them with that message about how they can help others in their own community.
I think that's such an awesome way to continue sharing his legacy and his story, not just here in the United States, but around the world. I think that's really, really great.
Yeah. And if people want to come on board and help out with the Sheriff Lucius T. Amerson Bridge Builder Foundation, please reach out. We need people with expertise in grant writing. We need people with expertise in fundraising. We need people that are passionate about helping people.
No, that's awesome. Well, as always, it's been a pleasure getting to see you and speak with you today. And I am so grateful to have had you on our podcast. But until next time, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you as well.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Icons, featuring Anthony Amerson and guest host Madison Scott, the museum's manager of volunteer services. We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.